Welcome to today's Harvard Business Review webinar, The CFO's Changing Role, Building the Future. I'm Angela Herron, Editor of Special Projects and Research at HBR, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I want to thank Workday for making this discussion possible. Traditionally, the role of the CFO focused on supervision and management of finance, duties that included managing investments, analyzing expenses, and tracking regulatory trends. But expectations of the job are shifting. Today, CFOs face never-ending pressure to cut costs, grow revenue, and ensure control. It's increasingly important for CFOs to be strategists, helping shape overall strategy and direction, and to act as catalysts, instilling a financial approach and mindset throughout the organization to help other parts of the business perform better. Deloitte's Stephen Ehrenholt is with us today to discuss the key roles that CFOs are now playing inside the organization and how senior finance executives and their teams can leverage digital technology in the future to deliver more impactful value in the company. Stephen is a principal with Deloitte Consulting and is the U.S. and global finance transformation leader. He has more than 27 years of experience providing consulting services to finance organizations to help increase their contribution to the company's value. He is with us today in Philadelphia. Thank you so much for joining us, Stephen.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you much for having me.
Stephen, as I mentioned in my introduction, we're talking today about the fact that CFOs are playing multiple roles. So how do you think about these different roles of the CFO in a company?
So, back in 2006, we started really putting together our thinking on this. And what we figured out is there are really four fundamental roles that the CFOs play in their organization, and that's mirrored actually in the rest of finance as a function. If we think back to our college psychology courses, many of us would remember Maslow's hierarchy. And while we've arrayed these functions or roles of the CFO in kind of a framework, you could actually think of it as a hierarchy. The first role, or the bottom of the hierarchy, would be the steward, and the steward in the organization really needs to focus on compliance, control, getting the numbers right. It's really the dial tone of the organization. If you don't have that, nothing else is going to happen. And one of the things that we're realizing, and for people who have been in an organization that didn't have good stewardship from finance, nothing else really matters until you bed that down and get it right. Once that's happened, very often people turn to finance and say, why are you so expensive? And then the focus becomes on the operator role. How do we drive down costs? How do we balance service levels relative to the efficiency of the organization? And those two roles together, very often we think of them in a way as playing defense. It's basically protecting and preserving the company, preserving its assets, spending what's needed to do finance right.
So that's the old school CFO.
That's the old school CFO, and that's not going away. So, but if over probably the 12 years since we've established this framework, we found in general when we speak to clients and CFOs, they would basically say they spend about 70% of their time doing those two roles. And there's really only 30% left over for the top two roles, or so to speak, for playing offense. But once CFOs kind of master that and they kind of drive a certain level of efficiency across the way stewardship and operator are performed, the organization begins to, in some cases, ask the CFO, can we do more to increase the value of the company? And then CFOs sort of turn to their strategist role of really leveraging insight and information to really support better decision-making across the company. And in the most evolved sense, very often when finance has done that really well, the organization knows that finance are the get-it-done people. And they give more and more responsibilities, even if it's not purely financial, to finance, and then finance can play a much broader catalyst role across the organization to really drive a financial understanding and a value mentality across the organization.
Now, are you saying that because the CFOs and their teams are showing that they have the understanding of the analytics? I mean, why are you calling them the get-it-done people?
The first thing is finance as a group is very heroic. In other words, in the face of many challenges of bad data, bad systems, they'll get it done no matter what. But very often finance people develop this process orientation, and that process thinking is really relevant to a whole series of challenges that the organization may face. So very often, even if it's not purely financial, so for example, if a company is thinking about enterprise-wide cost reduction, not just in finance, but across the company, looking at supply chain, looking at the customer interfaces, finance is very often very heavily in the mix because of their orientation to think from a process and efficiency perspective. So what's really interesting is when you think of the world and how it's changing, the fact that there's a framework related to the roles of CFOs that's been around since 2006, and we nor any of our clients have really found anything substantially better, tells you that the roles are really not changing. But I think what we're seeing now is there are a lot of forces at work in the world that are causing finance to rethink how all of this gets done. And I think that's really the story that we'd like to talk about for the rest of our session today. What's really changing, and what's it going to do to finance, and what are the opportunities, and what might finance look like in 2025?
Well, let's start then with talking about what are the forces and the pressures that CFOs ought to be thinking about.
Absolutely. So there are a couple of things that are really noteworthy when you think about this. And a lot of it actually really does relate to demographics, which I'm not going to go into too much, but a lot of it is also focused on the development of digital technologies. And we all know, and we've all experienced exponential growth in these technologies, their impact on society, and all of us in our personal lives, if you think about your life now versus your life in 2006, there's a lot of stuff that's just easier to get done. And what we're finding is that finance people are showing up to work, they know how well their lives work personally, and they come to work and they're facing all these constraints and data problems, systems that don't talk to each other, problems getting deep analytics. They know that artificial intelligence and cognitive technologies are very present in other domains and are maturing, and they're just not seeing it in their own lives. And so I think finance people as a group are very interested in figuring out how do we reimagine finance in the future based on these technologies.
So I think you've got a framework here that kind of shows us the way that technologies are combining, which I think is an interesting chart because we know about the individual technologies, but you're really thinking about how it all works together to change these jobs.
Absolutely, and that's the challenge. I think people who take one technology and they explore it and see how to exploit it, it's very limited because we need to think of this more like learning the alphabet. The individual technologies are just like letters in the alphabet, and we know that what we'd really like to do is write sentences and paragraphs, but you need to figure out and master the alphabet first. And the individual technologies are kind of work like that you need to master them, you need to experiment with them, get comfortable with them, understand what they can do, what the limitations are, and then you need to really combine them. And I think the thing that's really slowing us down now in finance is the challenge of combinatorial innovation, of how hard it is to actually take things and reimagine how work was done, not by looking at one technology, but by looking at the whole technology landscape and figuring out how do I combine robotics and cognitive and machine learning and advanced analytics and blockchain to actually rethink the activities of finance and to figure out what is going to be really the role of machines and what will people still be doing.
Was part of the challenge here that most people in a CFO role or in finance are not technologists?
That's a huge challenge right now, and I think that the talent challenge in finance is really daunting. I think finance has not yet figured out how to weave in other skill sets like data scientists and how to organize them within the organization. And they're also having trouble upskilling their own staff to actually take on those roles. No matter what you do to me, you're probably never going to turn me into a data scientist. And I think that people are realizing that, at a certain point, the ability to you can learn new things, but it becomes very difficult to get to the level of mastery you need to to really have the impact that you'd like to have by hiring a data scientist or people with those very specialized STEM skills.
So how do you recommend that CFOs and their teams start thinking about this? What questions should they be asking?
Well, I think there are two questions that we've seen that CFOs are asking today that they're very kind of keenly interested in. The first is they're getting all sorts of proposals from the larger business about digitization of the customer interface of the supply chain, and they're really puzzled by all of these investments, and they need to understand more about these technologies in order to guide the organization in what investments to make.
That means just in basic decision making about the investment.
The decision making, the finance as the purser of the organization is getting lots of requests for large funding amounts, and CFOs and finance organizations need to have a deep appreciation for technology in order to navigate which investments to make and which ones have greater or lesser payoffs. We're not going to talk too much more about that today, but the second question that CFOs are asking that's really focused on their own organizations and their vertical management of the function they're responsible for is really the question of how can finance itself make use of all of this digital technology and put it to work so that finance, and if we go back to that 4 phases of the CFO framework, really shift the balance from being roughly 70% of steward and operator to flip it and be more 70% strategist and catalyst. And I think that's the challenge that most CFOs we're talking to are trying to grapple with.
Now, I want to make the point here that you are not talking about thinking about technology simply as automating a bunch of work so that a lot of jobs go away. You actually have an idea about 3 areas that people ought to be focusing on in finance.
Yes, absolutely. I think the change, when you look at the impact of the changes that these technology have on the organization, we have to think about how does the work change? What changes do I need to make in my workforce? And lastly, what do I need to do to actually create a workplace that people want to come to that's really going to engage them? How do I get rid of the checkers and reconcilers and all of the not only non-value added work, but unfulfilling work that people in finance do? When very often when I start a project with a client, I'll start to, one of the basic things to do is just look at the timestamps on entries made by finance people. And it's just bizarre. You see people, who are there on, Saturday morning at 3 in the morning, kind of getting the work done because there's such a time crunch because of the quarterly rhythm of financial reporting and combined with poor systems and a lot of time pressure. And so you really see heroic activity on the part of finance, but everyone would really like to find a better way of doing things. I don't think this is an issue, and I know there's a lot in the press about robotics and destroying jobs. I think what we need to think about is what are people really good at relative to machines, and what are the enduring roles, but more importantly, how do we create a greater level of comfort with our staffs to actually work in an augmented fashion where the machine does what the machine is better at and we do what people are better at. And I think we're going to all need to get much more comfortable in this augmented world where people and machines collaborate in a much different way.
Now, through your work in companies and also in using some survey work that you did, you've come up with a set of predictions about what do you believe can happen or will happen in finance by 2025. Tell us about those, but how did you pick 2025 as the next big deadline? That's a really interesting question. We had a lot of debate about that. And we wanted to give it enough runway so that things could actually mature and that people had enough time to assimilate these technologies. But we didn't want it so far out that really you could no longer predict anything. So we found the sweet spot as we started this in 2017. We figured 7-8 years was enough time for this to play out for the most part. I think there are certain technologies and capabilities that will take longer to mature because there are some frictions in the marketplace that are just going to slow down certain things that require more general agreement on standards, as well as collaboration across ecosystems as opposed to within companies. So just by way of example,
One of the things that's more straightforward is robotic process automation, robotic processes, robotic technologies. And I think there companies have already taken that up to a large extent, or at least experimented with them. And we have lots of examples where companies have already scaled robots so that even in finance, they might have 200 or 300 bots operating, taking over tasks that were rote, labor-intensive tasks that people were doing. On the other hand, you see much less take-up, at least in finance, of blockchain, because the value of blockchain is really working across different organizations, across an ecosystem. So people have experimented within companies at using blockchain for things like intercompany processing, because it kind of mirrors a multi-entity problem. But the scaling of that and the impact of blockchain, I think, will take a lot longer to play out in the finance ecosystem. What we did for our predictions, we basically, the exam question we gave ourselves was, just with currently available technology, assuming no massive changes or improvements to those technologies, though we know there will be some, we said, what might finance look like in 2025 if you started really combining and playing this out? I don't think any one company is actually there yet, but I think a lot of companies have already taken meaningful steps into this journey. And so what we're going to share with you actually has, from the survey results we have in asking people about these predictions, there's a remarkably high level of agreement, anywhere from the mid-70s to 92% agreement of the people who have come to our site and filled out the survey. So we actually think that these predictions have some validity to them, but we know we'll be wrong about some things, because that's just the risk of putting yourself out there and making predictions.
So show us the world of the future.
Yes. So the first thing, it will be a wild ride. So the part of the problem is that that I think people face is that we're going to talk about a context for finance that a lot of finance people wish they lived in, but have a hard time seeing their way to get there.
Okay, what do you mean?
So the world we'll describe is a world that most finance people would look at and say, I want to be in that world. That's a much better world for me than my work today and the way we work today. But there's a lot of effort that will be required to get from here to there, and the path isn't fully clear yet. So let's move on to the first prediction, is that basically a lot of transactions are going to be touchless. And I think the capability to do this is already there. The need for labor to actually process routine transactions, a sale, a purchase, are going to be largely automated. And we see already in a lot of companies' shared services centers, they're able to do this to a large extent. I think this trend will just continue, and the dominant environment that people operate in will be much less intrusive in terms of having human labor doing the very basic transactions that have to be processed. So it will be touchless. We do mention blockchain, that we think blockchain will reach deeper into the organization. I think that I will expect to see blockchain, especially when it comes to very complex interrelationships between different types of companies. So for example, in telecommunications, the telcos have a lot of interactions with each other to settle when you use my network, when I used your network, when I did this for you, when you did that for me. And so that settlement process is something that I think blockchain can actually solve. So we're going to see more and more instances of blockchain by then. I think right now what you see is a period of experimentation, but not as much scaling. And I think once some standards are established with blockchain, they figure out how to deal with greater throughput, I think we're going to see blockchain in more places. The next prediction is actually about the role of finance, and this one is a bit controversial.
Yeah, I was just going to say, any slide that starts out with "success is not assured" is going to make everybody stop and go, wait a minute.
Absolutely, and I think that when you look at CFOs and finance's impact, they'd like to really, once you unburden yourself with all those transactions, you'd like to devote your energy to creating insight. And finance really aspires to do this, but they've aspired to do this for the better part of a decade. The real challenge is how you're going to get it done, what's in the way, And when we say success is not assured, there are some capacity constraints, so you need to unburden yourself from other things. There are some capability constraints. You need to have the right skills and talent in your organization. There are also collaboration constraints. If you just think about the challenge of, and if you just conducted a thought experiment and you said, what if each person in finance knew everything that finance collectively knows, and so the business partner assigned to a business leader was going into that conversation with the knowledge of the collective finance organization? Today, that person knows a very small percentage of what is actually known by the collective. And so the ability of finance to create platforms to collaborate and integrate their knowledge so that each person in the organization who interacts outside the organization is really armed by what the organization collectively knows would be an extremely powerful thing. So that's
you're talking about dashboards? Are you talking about data viz here? What are you talking about?
It's collaboration platforms. Some companies have used things like Slack or Microsoft Teams, other types of technologies, but I think no one has really seen this as sort of a core problem, and I think with the rise of the digital world, people have a much better understanding of the value of the crowd, that the crowd knows more than the individual, and that it would behoove finance to actually take advantage of its, it may not be the crowd as the world, but it's the crowd of finance, and that will arm each person in finance much more capably to deal with questions that arise from the business.
There's one last thing on this slide I have to ask you about, which is the idea of co-location with the business. What do you mean by that?
So I think that right now, what people have generally assumed is if I'm going to be the key strategic advisor to a business leader, I need to sit next to them. And there is an element of human relationships involved where you need to have just basic human, regular interactions. But I think more and more we're going to be seeing people do this in a very agile and remote way. And as the technologies get better for actually, whether it's video, whether it's calls, collaboration platforms, I think we're going to see more and more optimization of where people are, where are the resources, where are the skills, where's the lowest cost labor to do it, and not just in the sense of of the factory of finance seeking the absolute lowest cost. It's really where are the best resources for the money to do the things I want to do, and will be a little less tied to location.
Wow, so you really are talking about some organizational structure things that may change, our whole way of thinking about it. Well, in your next thing you talk about, which is finance cycles, as we talked before the discussion, finance cycles are monthly, they're quarterly, so people are going to have to operate in a whole different sort of time sequence.
Absolutely. The technologies today are quite powerful in terms of enabling a transaction that happens to be instantly available to everyone and aggregated, and there's zero latency in the, so to speak, in the posting. And finance is used to working on this quarterly rhythm of financial that's really been dictated by external reporting. And when we talk to finance people, what we're hearing is they understand and conceptually they kind of buy into the idea that they probably should, from an intuitive sense, have instantly available data, but quite frankly, not everyone is sure yet what to do with it. And I think that as the capability is there, people will figure out what things they could do better as a result of having instant information, whether it's daily sales, a daily view of financial performance. I think it's conceptually and practically possible. It just hasn't been done in that many companies to date, and I think that will change by 2025. Next one is also controversial, self-service. I think, in finance we'll be very uneasy with this. The capability when we think about how we use chatbots and other tools in our own lives to get information ourselves, to solve problems ourselves, it is not far-fetched to imagine that in a very short couple of years, these capabilities will be resident in the finance organization. And a key business leader, instead of picking up the phone and asking his finance business partner, what did those 3 products do last quarter, he or she will actually turn to it could be on their phone or on their laptop or desktop, and talk to a chatbot that will be connected to the client's, to the company's ERP systems, and will ask it in natural language, ask questions, and receive responses. And I think finance is uneasy about the prospect of disintermediation.
Because they're going to lose jobs, or because they don't trust us? I mean, frankly, I have trouble getting my expense report through. So, I mean, the self-service thing is still a ways away.
Yes,
for me.
it's definitely a ways away. We see people piloting it. Right now, we do not yet see, we see it, by the way, in lots of other domains. We just don't see it in finance yet. Where finances actually have an industrial strength chatbot that enables people to get at their, answer their own questions. What that will enable is finance to get out of the basics and really do the much more sophisticated analysis, which I think is the aspiration of finance people. And as soon as the technology allows it, they will be freed up to do that. But they are going to be very uneasy about being disintermediated from all the questions that business leaders are asking.
Well, and you also make the point on this slide that there's another reason for them to be uneasy, which is that you're pushing a lot of information, vital internal information, out to a lot of endpoints. So the whole question of security must make finance very uneasy right now.
Yes, finance are, as a profession, they're more cautious than most, but I think that will be that will actually be a matter of just solving that cybersecurity and also confidentiality issue. But I think that it will happen. I think that friction that slows it down will not stop it. It'll just slow it down a bit. The next one relates to the operating model, and quite frankly, I think that we're going to have to get used to having robots and algorithms as sort of members of our teams, and stop thinking of it as destroying the job, but more that we will work together with the algorithms and with the machines to actually make decisions, to execute tasks. And so I think that's changing the prospect of different operating models. From 2006, when we, when we started creating the four faces of the CFO, probably for a good decade, if you looked at what a lot of large companies in corporate America were doing, certainly, it was really taking the factory of finance and trying to put it in a lower cost location and moving jobs. For the most part, there was some focus on efficiency, though not terribly much, quite frankly. They reaped a lot of benefits from the labor arbitrage, got some efficiencies, but there really wasn't terribly much automation that was done in that decade. And I think right now what we're really seeing is that the automation tools for automating tasks have gotten a lot greater. So I think people are going to, when they start thinking about whether to move a job to a lower cost location, they're now pausing, and instead of saying, you know what, I could do that for less money with labor in this other location, what they're actually saying is, well, how much of this could I automate? And I think that is going to slow down the mass movement of jobs to lower cost locations. It will still be going on, but I think it's going to be more cautious and with a greater recognition that maybe we should think about automating something instead of moving it.
So is there another way of thinking about freelancers and gig workers?
Absolutely. I think that, as we know from, lots of environments where we've been able to parse out work to others, whether it's, in pharma, Innocentive, Mechanical Turk, Top Coder for programming. There are a lot of platforms that enable gig workers to help solve problems. And I think that what we're hearing from the expectations of CFOs, and actually our last CFO survey that we did at Deloitte, we do quarterly surveys, what we had asked some specific questions about the expectation for the rise in contract and gig workers, and people have basically said they expect it to go from about 8% to about 16%, so a doubling. And so we expect to see a meaningful growth in the use of gig workers to do all sorts of tasks. And I don't think that's been that common right now in finance, but we do expect it to grow.
So talk to us about this next one, because in my lifetime, my business work lifetime, ERP planning has been this huge issue. So how do you think this is going to change?
Well, I think that people are very dissatisfied as a general rule with the legacy ERP. They found that it It took really a death march to get it in. If you're a large global company and marching around the world to get it done, it took a lot of work. And people found that while it may have had significant benefit in terms of how they process transactions, it didn't really do as much for them as they expected when it came to insight and analytics. And so right now, there have been a lot of smaller companies that have been chipping away and innovating at some of the challenges that finance organizations face. So just as a simple example, take natural language generation. You have a bunch of companies out there that can ingest data and then write a commentary. There are a lot of finance people today who write commentary on financial results. Thinking about automating that with a high degree of accuracy is a prospect that really removes some labor from that process. And having seen some of these tools at work, it does a pretty good job. But when you look at these companies that are doing that innovation, they're relatively small companies. The big boys of ERP, the Oracles and SAPs of the world, and Workday, who's sponsoring our session today, I don't think they're going to sit idly by as little robotics and cognitive vendors eat their lunch. I believe they're going to buy or build those capabilities. And so right now, I don't think we have a stable market. I think it's a very dynamic market. We don't know who all the winners will be, but I believe the larger players are going to buy the smaller and innovative players who have capabilities that would add to their systems. And I don't know exactly how it will all play out, but the SAP, Oracle, Workday, they're not going to go silently into the night on this one. I think they really want to be part of part of that picture of who's really driving insight and analytics and value into corporate America, and I believe that they will end up playing a significant role. And I think that's currently evolving. The story's not fully written yet.
But it sounds to me like this is a role where a CFO can have real impact in talking about what we need, what we should be asking.
Absolutely. The CFOs they all have this expectation from their personal lives of, that they'll go to Google and they'll get information that they need. And what they'd really like to do is figure out, well, how do I have something like Google sitting on top of my financial systems? How can I just query the system, ask for information, ask for things in sophisticated ways to get more sophisticated insight back from what's the data resident in my organization. And I think that is really where I think CFOs would like to head. And I think there's really a race going on to figure out who will really be the platform companies that corporate America looks to create insight out of their data.
So, and then the next slide, prediction that you put up, I laughed when I saw it because we were having a discussion about data, and that basically this slide says to me, data will be important and it's still going to be a headache.
Yeah, there are certain things that technology hasn't solved for us yet. So if you have a multi-division company and you do not govern your data, and each division changes definitions, uses fields differently in your systems, and you, at the end of the day, you can't aggregate it all and look at your data across the company in a common way. And so data stewardship will be very important. And a lot of companies, especially those that grew by acquisition and that really didn't clean up their data as they were acquiring the company, very often all they did is they aggregated at a summary level. I think in order to get real granularity and deep insight, you need to have consistent data across your company. And this is one of the areas where technology has not really solved the problem. We see in some very specific domains that there have been some progress, for example, in kind of looking at spend data and being able to use cognitive tools to put it into spend categories. There are small problems like that I think the technology has solved, but in terms of the massive challenges related to consistent data, we're just not there yet.
Have you seen CFOs taking on a bigger role when it comes to data and analytics throughout the company?
I think CFOs definitely aspire to that. It's a goal. I think there's actually a little bit of a race. I think there's a part of a part of what I would call the heart of the business, whether it's marketing, sales, supply chain, that's doing a lot of analytics in their own domains. I think the CIOs of companies are trying to be the providers of that analytics, and I think finance is also well positioned. How that race plays out, I don't think we really know. I was in a session with a particular company, and someone in finance, was sort of lamenting, the work that the CIO had been doing in analytics, and I asked him, I said, did they not do a good job? She says, no, that's exactly the point. They're doing too good of a job, and we wanted to do that. So I think there really is a question of who will really be, the chief analytics officer in the company, and I think finance would like to do that. Whether they win that mantle or not, I think is still the jury's still out.
And then finally, talk to us about the workplace and the workforce, because this raises already a lot of questions are coming in about that. So,
look, I think what people are saying. Just first in terms of workforce, people are looking for STEM skills, but it's not just STEM skills. Finance, I was on a session with a couple of CFOs, and one of them said, what I actually need is more storytellers. I need someone who can take our data and craft the story, for the investor community, for Wall Street, make our case internally to different executives in the organization. So I think finance is now waking up to the idea that there probably is a significant transformation of that workforce that's necessary. Part of it is upskilling and kind of making people in the organization more tech savvy and recognizing that technology is really part of everything that everyone does. It's not that you're becoming a technology company, it's that everything is about, solutions all require technology today. None of it is just conceptual. So I think that will require a significant environmental change. And in terms of workplace also, I think, we'll see a lot more kind of attempts to really engage workers in a more innovative way and create an environment that basically enables greater collaboration across different parts of finance and different parts of the company. And so I think we will see, and again, I don't think many companies in finance have made this holistic change yet, but I would expect to see lots of investments and progress in the area of upskilling workers and changing the workforce. And by the way, it includes taking some very new focused skill sets and figuring out how to weave them into a traditional finance organization. Like how do you want to organize your data scientists who are going to help you with machine learning algorithms that would help you everything from clearing your receivables more automatically to creating insights about, how do we figure out, where we're losing money and, or who might be pilfering our stores, and, using all sorts of technologies and facial recognition and analytics to, solve those problems. You really need a much more sophisticated data science capability, and I think finance is beginning to recognize that.
So we have a lot of questions building up here. We're basically saying, all right, so how do I get started on making this transformation? So let's get to the how-to part of the show.
So the how-to, well, here are a couple of, kind of questions that I think everyone is really talking about now. But what I think what companies are actually doing, those who have moved ahead the furthest and fastest that we see in the marketplace, the first thing they're doing is they are starting with a beginner's mind, and they have a culture of experimentation. They're basically saying, I don't know exactly what blockchain will do for me, but if I don't start learning about it and experimenting with it, when it really hits and really presents that opportunity, I won't be prepared. So the first thing we see companies doing is experimentation and establishing essentially a decentralized structure to experiment, but some central governance to coordinate the results of all those experiments. They'd like to get lots of different people trying lots of different things and seeing how it works out and what could we do with it. But then they'd like to really get those experiments basically pooled so they could get a better understanding of where to go next. The second thing companies are doing is they're seeing what works, and the companies that have sort of done some of this experimentation are trying to figure out how do we scale the things that have worked? How do we really go big time to have significant impact? If you do one or two bots to automate a few tasks, it's unlikely that you're going to really drive very much efficiency to the bottom line. when you start to scale and you have 200 or 300 bots operating in finance, then all of a sudden you're going to see, well, I could look across those bots and there's a lot of data and insight I have because I actually know everything that that bot did and I know how it worked out, what's kicking out, where there are process efficiencies I could gain. So my sense is that this issue of scaling will be very important going forward, and finance to really pick its spots of where are the places they really want to have impact.
So they're really tracking that ROI.
Absolutely, absolutely. They really want to understand what are the technologies that are going to have the greatest impact on efficiency, as well as their ability to generate insight to drive impact to the performance of the company.
One of our listeners asked, are they also tying their experiments to pain points in the line of business? And
so, absolutely. So the way they pick their pilots is they go pick a place where they see the most pain. So very often what companies will do is they'll do some kind of analysis of where are our people, where are our full-time equivalents really spending their time? How many hours, how many days, how many human beings are really devoted to tasks that look like they might be ameliorated through the application of technology. So they're doing a broad assessment of, and they create actually a heat map of which parts of finance have the most labor that might be automated, or which topics for leadership and management are the areas of greatest interest where finance might invest more in deep analytics and insights. So for example, one retailer that I've worked with, they had a really big issue with loss prevention, okay, of what's happening in our stores. And so they went through a deep analytic process to actually predict where losses would occur across their portfolio of stores, which really gave them a much better insight into how to prevent those losses going forward. So it's really about finance picking spots of intervention where you could drive the most value to prove it out, which then also gives you the energy to go back to your executive committee for greater funding to sort of scale your pilots.
So take us through this chart. I'm particularly interested when you talk about what's finance's digital strategy. Do you mean what problems do you want to solve first? What do you mean when you talk about digital strategy?
It's really about how we bring together the possibilities of all this technology with the reality of the company's current state. So you want to start with where do you have pain, but also where you have opportunity. And I think that's what people are trying to figure out in the early stages. Once they develop a more mature understanding of the technologies, how to apply them, they gain some expertise, they then it opens up a new window that they've kind of bought an option to now look further into the organization of what could have the most broad impact across the finance organization.
And who's in on that conversation? I mean, I can't imagine the CFO sits alone at his desk and goes, I'm asking myself these questions.
Very often with the CFO, the truth is the CFO has good perspective, but he really needs to engage his whole organization to unearth the issues that are sort of most subject to pain. Very often a CFO may get a question from the CEO, and then he turns to his staff and asks the question to his staff. And then the CFO really has no idea how many hours it took his or her staff, to respond to the question. And so they may come back the next day, but the CFO doesn't know if they worked all night or not, or if they just pressed a button. And then very often the CFO will ask a follow-up question, and finance may or may not be able to answer the follow-up question, or it might take 3 weeks. So I think that part of what the CFO needs to do in order to lead this change, aside from becoming tech savvy him or herself, I think he needs to have a better appreciation for where are the pain points, where are the opportunities in the organization, and that only comes from engaging his broader team, and often a few levels down.
So then the next stage of the questions to ask really focus on, again, it's more survey, trying to understand what and who and where. So talk about how you analyze that.
So this is really a matter of kind of getting into the organization and its specifics to really understand at a more granular level. If you look at a process, let's say, how do we buy things, how do we sell things, purchase to pay, order to cash, how do we look at that entire end-to-end process and determine what's really the blocking point that's preventing us from doing this seamlessly, fully automatically? Where do we have challenges in reconciling data that's getting in the way of our analytical insight? So I really think this is a matter of unearthing the issues in the current organization, but at the same time, it's part of a recognition that finance that may not necessarily have all the capabilities, skill sets, people, structure that they need to have to solve all these issues. And I think that's where people are really thinking about a broader strategic question. How could we be better organized? How do we become more agile? How do we do more with less? How do we have more impact on the organization given the investments we might make? And then picking their spots of which investments to make.
So you have to take a tough look at current state and then have a very clear picture of where you want to go. Which means that you're going to encounter some challenges along the way, which brings you to your next stage of questions, which are these are tough questions for leaders. I mean, these are big questions that every organization is trying to grapple with right now because of the impact on technology. So talk about how finance leaders are thinking about that.
So quite frankly, I think this is an area of where there are no easy answers, quite frankly, from my perspective right now. I think that finance needs to get comfortable being uncomfortable because, especially for CFOs, we also have a generational issue when you look at the average age of the CFOs and how deep are they in these technologies, in this environment. And very often I think they need to look within their organizations to find diamonds in the rough, find the bright spots and amplify them and grow them. But I think there's no question that this is the challenge of leading a digital transformation for finance is a very sophisticated challenge, and I think the CFOs need to have, the typical, driver CFO who's really driving for results all the time, but the CFO also needs to be a really good integrator of information and insight from across the organization. There may be other parts of the company that have done more on digital than finance has done, and I think what finance needs to do is sort of open up the aperture of who they're looking to for inspiration, for insight, for training, for advice, for skills, in order to bring all of that to bear to really reimagine how different components of finance could work in the future.
So you did mention the average age of CFOs, so I have to ask you, do we have a group of CFOs who are long experienced, and are we about to have a new wave of CFOs? How long do CFOs stay in their jobs anyway?
Well, the more recent statistics are roughly about 5 years, and so the CFO comes in, and one of the first things they want to do is take a look at the basic infrastructure of the finance organization, because in the first couple of years, what a CFO really wants to do is establish the infrastructure they think they're going to need for the rest of their tenure in order to create the legacy that they would like to create for themselves and their reputation. And very often, it's hard for a CFO to worry about too many problems that are more than 5 years out because there's so much pressure and focus on earnings, on the next quarter, on the next year. So that if you say to a CFO, take a 5-year horizon on digital, that's about as much as they have appetite for.
Wow. Yeah, but yet you're asking people to take a really over-the-horizon look at what the organization is going to look at. One of the things that you have on this chart is the discussion around the future of work and how does that change talent and careers and learning. And then you have this interesting point, which we hear a lot about at HBR, which is how do you change the workforce experience? What do you mean by that when it comes to finance?
Look, if you took a videotape, a video recorder to sort of film finance people doing their work, you would see a large percentage of people doing work that they don't think is very fulfilling. They're doing things because of the poor infrastructure that many companies have. They're reconciling systems. They're moving data from one place to another. They're working on a very labor-intensive board book or executive committee book that's going over results. And they know that their work environment could be better. And I think the challenge is that people are going to, have been, and if finance really wants to incorporate and recruit these new skills and skill sets, You cannot bring these people into this mess of an environment. Within a year, they get frustrated and they're already looking to leave. And I think the challenge is figuring out you need the new blood to actually fix the basic infrastructure of the organization to really change the nature of the jobs that are there, but you need new blood to do that. And so there's a real tension and a yin and yang in the environment today between how committed and how much of a plan do you need to have for fixing finance versus how early do you start bringing in these new people with new skill sets. One of the things that we were working with the CFO of a really large telco and sent him a big kind of overview of digital and what was happening in his organization. And he came in Monday morning and said, I'd like to talk about page 137. And page 137 was a comparison between his job postings for finance for his organization versus several digital companies. And so one of the things that we need to really change is who and what we're looking for as we recruit into finance. But if you recruit those, let's call it the digital natives into finance, and you ask them to spend their lives reconciling between systems, they're gone. So you need to have a commitment to make that change and clearly communicate it and kind of recruit on that basis. But it's going to be really challenging to balance those two things, to get the right people in the door with the new skill sets, but at the same time have those people begin to see the changes at work so that even if it's not quite there yet, they see the progress so that they're going to stick around for the journey.
These are so many challenges on this one page. We have I'll just jump in here. We have a lot of questions coming in, and one of the questions definitely is around this whole question of upskilling and retraining. Can you talk a little bit about how you're seeing organizations approach that, especially now that you've set up that tension between bringing in people and working with the people that you have? Tell us what you see and maybe how you've approached it at Deloitte.
So we actually, for us, and we've actually seen a lot of clients do it. And by the way, one of the things that's very interesting, like virtually every professional body in finance is worried about this now. All the CPA groups, in the U.S., globally, and what we're really seeing is we're seeing the requirement to actually create the kind of training that can be offered to help people who are self-starters really upgrade their skills. And there's a lot of training that's actually out there in the marketplace. There are some companies that have announced recently before people start, they're sending them for very intensive Python training before they even join the bank. And I think this is a fascinating development because it's the beginning of this recognition. I don't think that all the training is quite there yet. We at Deloitte, one of the things that we've done is we've said, even if your job is not a technology-oriented job, everybody in the company needs to be tech savvy. And I think that we're going to see more and more programs like this in the environment. And virtually every CFO we talk to is basically asking for that kind of training. And we're actually working on that because we don't think that there's, specifically for finance, that we have the training out there in the marketplace yet that actually is what finance people can take in and adapt to really help them learn about all these different technologies, and more specifically, how they can be combined to reimagine the different things that finance does.
So you're not talking about just racing out and hiring a new load of people. I mean, first of all, there's not enough of those people even to hire, but there's a keen understanding that we have to train who we have now because they're the ones who have knowledge of how finance works, right? So.
Yes, but there will. I think it's going to be an and story, not an or story. I think that you could send me back to school, but you're not really going to make me a data scientist at this point in my career. But I think we are going to need to hire more data scientists into finance. But at the same time, even the current finance workforce who really understands that current environment, both in finance as well as the business of that company, I think we need to really upskill everybody and provide a foundational level of training so that everyone is much more comfortable with technology, even if they graduated with an accounting or finance degree 10 years ago.
Now, you mentioned it briefly, but could you talk some more about how you're seeing CFOs and CIOs work together? Because what you just laid out would seem to me to really demand that the two work very, very closely.
Absolutely. I think they need to work together because not just to upgrade or digitize the finance function, but it's also because those two CXOs together are actually creating and then considering all the proposals from the business about creating a more digital company. And there are I would say that the asks far exceed most companies' investment capacity. And so there's a real need for CFOs to exercise together with CIOs great wisdom in really understanding these technologies and then figuring out which investments are going to make the most sense for the company as a whole.
Are there specific industries or kinds of companies that you find are more evolved or further along in this journey when it comes to finance?
It's interesting. I don't think there's really a sector answer that one industry is so much more ahead than in others. There are always some industries that are a little sleepier and some that are more aggressive, and the more financial pressure you face, the more aggressive companies and more responsive companies typically are to the environment. But in every sector, what we're seeing is it's the lead steers in the herd that are moving the quickest. So it's the companies that are already very well regarded in general and specifically in finance that have made a lot of investments, that have a pretty good shop already, and they're in the best position to move ahead. In many cases, that actually goes back to the data story. Companies that have their data already cleaned up, that don't have lots of inconsistencies, that have invested in getting kind of a more unified financial platform, they're finding it much easier to push ahead. What people are finding is data is the fuel of everything in digital, and if your data is good, you can move a lot faster.
Stephen, I've got a couple of variations on this question, so I'll read this one, which is the role of the CFO is very demanding. Most of the time we're busy in meetings, we're trying to just meet the requirements of the job. I mean, how do we find time to think about strategy and policy improvement? I mean, where do you see people carving out this time?
Well, it's interesting. Probably 12 or 13 years ago, we put out a little publication that we called Breathing Lessons. It was one of the first things we did for CFOs, and the first observation was there's no time. That basically, we actually had decided it had to be a really short book because no one would take more than 10 minutes to read it. But I think that's still true as the question really reveals. I think the insight of how to resolve that, look, CFOs are always going to have, personally, a lot of demands on their time. And I think what they need to do is really arm their teams and those under them to spend less time on the creation of information and more time on the insight that they derive from the information. So this is, to some extent, a capacity challenge. Once the capacity challenge and you kind of create some efficiency, there's also a capability challenge, which is we need more people who understand how to navigate this data, have core business skills, have analytical skills, technology skills to come together to really solve some of these more and work on the more vexing issues. And I think the best thing that CFOs can do is really help identify what really are those most important pressure points where the intervention of finance on generating insight is going to really generate the most value. And I think every CFO who's worth his or her salt kind of knows that intuitively of what are the real vexing issues that people ought to work on.
I know you had one closing thought for us on the challenge of combinational innovation. That's a big mouthful.
Yes, it actually is, it's actually an interesting issue. I've just put up a picture of someone that probably no one in the audience has ever heard of. It's a guy named Bernard Sadow, and he's actually the owner of a patent. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he's the owner of a patent that was actually filed for in the 70s. And his patent was on putting wheels on luggage. Now, if you actually think about it, if you go back in history, and you could all Google it, wheels have probably been around for at least 3,000 years. And actually luggage, you could actually go back to the Bible and find references to sacks and other things that constituted luggage. So somehow or another, it's taken more than 3,000 years to just figure out to put the wheels on the luggage, right? And so the real question is, and to me, this is the challenge of combinatorial innovation. We know about wheels, we know about luggage, but how are we going to put them together to really rethink travel and the ease for the customer and in traveling and navigating airports, et cetera? And I think that this is really the essence of the challenge that finance faces, because what they really need to do is master these technologies, experiment with them, but then sit back and look at everything in finance and ask themselves, how can I reimagine how we do forecasting using all these technologies? How do I reimagine how we reproduce the MD&A, the management discussion and analysis for my 10Q or 10K? Virtually everything in finance can be done better and differently with these technologies, and it's really a matter of creative finance people understanding these technologies and then working together to figure that all out.
It's a great aspirational description of the future of finance. Stephen, this has been a great discussion, but I am afraid we are out of time. So I want to thank you, I want to thank all the audience, and I want to thank Workday for making this discussion possible. This concludes our presentation. Have a great day.